Rome built the greatest army in history, and at the center of that army was the Gladius. Short, fast, lethal, the weapon that supposedly conquered the known world. So when Vikings started raiding Roman successor states centuries later, conventional history treats it as barbarism overwhelming civilization. The physics tells a completely different story. The Gladius was not just outmatched, it was structurally obsolete before the first Viking ever set foot on a beach. The length illusion. Everyone treats the Gladius as Rome's greatest strength. It was Rome's greatest compromise. The Gladius measured 60 to 70 centimeters on most variants, with some types reaching 80 centimeters at the upper end. A standard Viking sword consistently measured 80 to 90 centimeters, with many examples pushing past 95. On paper, that looks like a minor difference. In sword physics, it is decisive. Reach determines who lands the first blow. In an open engagement between two fighters of equal skill, the longer weapon strikes before the shorter one can respond. The Gladius user had to close distance aggressively to get inside the Viking blade's arc before they could use their own weapon effectively. Every step forward was a step deeper into the opponent's kill zone. Every step forward invited a strike the Gladius could not yet answer. But here is what makes this more than a simple reach argument. The Gladius was deliberately kept short, not because Romans didn't understand reach, because the Gladius was engineered for one specific tactical context: the shield wall. Roman legionaries fought packed shoulder to shoulder, scutum to scutum. In that formation, a longer blade became a liability. You couldn't swing it without hitting your own men. The Gladius thrived in exactly one scenario, and that scenario required the entire Roman formation to be intact, coordinated, and functioning perfectly. Remove the formation, and the Gladius loses its entire tactical reason for existing. It becomes a shorter blade in an open fight against a longer one. That is not a competition. That is a geometry problem with one answer. Vikings did not fight in tight Roman formations. They fought individually, in loose groups, in raids, on beaches, in halls, in the kind of chaotic close quarters where formation doctrine collapses instantly. Every engagement condition the Vikings preferred was the exact condition that turned the Gladius's greatest tactical strength into a structural liability with no solution. The steel gap that shouldn't exist. Here's the history becomes genuinely shocking. Roman gladii were produced using the piling technique, forge welding strips of higher carbon steel edges onto softer iron cores. This showed real metallurgical understanding and produced blades that were functional and effective for their era. But the process was inconsistent. Metallurgical analysis of surviving Roman swords shows significant variation in carbon distribution, and archaeological evidence confirms that slag inclusions weakened many blades. Mass production required to equip tens of thousands of legionaries meant quality control was always secondary to quantity. Rome needed 100,000 functional swords, not 10,000 perfect ones. The difference between the best Roman gladius and the average one was significant. Viking swords, particularly from the 9th and 10th centuries, represented something that should not have existed for another 1,000 years. Researchers have analyzed approximately 170 surviving Ulfbert swords, the elite Viking blades inscribed with the maker's mark. What those analyses found broke the standard historical timeline completely. These specific blades were made from crucible steel, a process that fully dissolved carbon into the iron, eliminating slag and impurities entirely. The result was a homogeneous, high-carbon steel with carbon content reaching 1.2% or higher, 3 times the carbon of contemporary European swords, a material composition that would not become standard in Europe until the Industrial Revolution. The best Roman gladii used forge-welded composite construction with inconsistent results. The Ulfbert used pure crucible steel with uniform carbon distribution and flexibility that allowed the blade to absorb impact and return to shape. These two weapons were not competing from the same technological era. The Viking elite sword was centuries ahead of anything Rome could consistently produce. And here is what makes this worse for Rome. The Ulfbert's crucible steel was sourced through trade routes connecting Scandinavia to Central Asia, where the process was already established. Vikings were not inventing superior metallurgy from scratch. They were importing it through the same trading networks that made them such formidable long-range raiders. Rome had no equivalent trade network reaching those steel sources, and no internal process capable of replicating the result. What happens when they actually meet? The gladius cross-section is rhomboidal, a flattened diamond shape that provided reasonable rigidity for thrusting. This geometry worked adequately for its designed purpose, driving the point between ribs in close quarters formation combat. But adequate is not the same as engineered for survival under repeated impact stress. A Viking sword's pattern-welded construction, and especially the Ulfbert's crucible steel core, created a blade that flexed as a unified structure under hard contact. When the blade struck another weapon or a hard surface, force distributed through the entire length and the blade returned to shape. It bent and recovered. The edge deformed slightly under stress and held together. The Gladius, even with its piled construction, could not match this. The interface between the high-carbon edge steel and the softer iron core created a structural boundary where stress concentrated under lateral impact. The blade did not flex as a perfectly uniform unit because it was not a perfectly uniform unit. Under the kind of repeated hard contact that real individual combat delivers continuously, those boundaries became failure points. Edge-to-edge contact between a spring-tempered Viking sword and a Roman Gladius was not a contest between equals. It was a materials test the Gladius was not built to consistently pass, against a blade engineered specifically to survive exactly that kind of punishment repeatedly. The guard problem. There is a physical dimension to this matchup that almost nobody discusses accurately. The Gladius had a basic handguard, typically made from wood or bone. It was minimal, functional within Roman combat doctrine, and provided some protection during the thrusting actions the Gladius was designed for. But it was not a crossguard in any meaningful sense. It did not extend laterally beyond the blade edges in a way that protected the hand during blade contact or enabled binding techniques. Viking swords featured a pronounced metal crossguard, a horizontal bar extending beyond both edges of the blade. This geometry did something the Gladius guard could not. It protected the hand during lateral blade contact, and it gave the fighter a structural anchor for blade-on-blade engagement. With a crossguard, a Viking fighter could meet an incoming blade, apply lateral pressure, and control the engagement without risking the opponent's edge running down the blade into an unprotected hand. Without that structural protection, the Gladius user had no safe way to engage in blade binding at all. Any attempt to catch or deflect with the Gladius risked the opponent's edge traveling directly toward an inadequately protected hand. This forced Roman individual sword technique into a single tactical lane. Thrust, withdraw, repeat. Against an opponent with a longer blade, a metal crossguard, and the training to use blade control as a primary technique, that single lane becomes predictable within seconds. Predictable in a sword fight is a death sentence. The Ulfbert was not the average Viking sword. This needs to be said clearly because the argument collapses without it. The Ulfbert represented the absolute peak of Viking metallurgy, not the standard. Only around 170 genuine examples have been identified out of thousands of surviving Viking swords. The average Viking fighter carried a pattern-welded blade of bloomery iron, meaningfully better than Roman production in flexibility and toughness, but not in the same category as crucible steel. This actually makes the comparison more interesting, not less devastating for Rome. Even the average Viking sword, with its pattern-welded construction distributing stress more evenly through the blade, outperformed the inconsistent piled construction of mass-produced Roman gladii in individual combat durability. The Ulfbert simply made the gap so extreme it becomes almost unfair to quantify. The floor of Viking sword quality exceeded the ceiling of what Roman mass production consistently delivered, and the ceiling of Viking sword quality was technology Rome could not have produced under any circumstances. The formation trap. If you put a Roman legion in the field against a Viking raiding party in open-pitched battle, Rome wins. This is not in dispute. Roman tactical doctrine, iron discipline, and formation cohesion would overwhelm individual Viking fighters operating without equivalent organization. But that is precisely the point. Vikings never fought that battle. Viking raids targeted coastlines, monasteries, river towns, and settlements. They arrived fast by sea, struck before any organized formation could assemble, and withdrew before coordinated resistance could respond. The tactical conditions that made the Gladius devastating, massed formations with interlocking shields and coordinated thrusting into compressed gaps, were exactly the conditions Vikings systematically and deliberately avoided ever creating. When individual combat did occur, the Gladius faced a weapon with superior reach, superior steel, a proper crossguard enabling blade control, and a fighter who trained specifically for unstructured individual engagements. Rome's entire system had no contingency for an enemy who refused to stand in front of it and fight on its terms. The real reason Rome never faced this problem: Vikings and Roman legions never actually met in battle. The Western Roman Empire collapsed in 476 AD. The Viking Age began in earnest around 793 AD. 3 centuries of darkness separated them. This is the twist the debate always skips. The comparison is not a historical event. It is a physics question about two weapons stripped of their armies, their systems, and their formations, measured against each other directly in individual combat. The Gladius was a brilliant weapon inside a brilliant system. Remove the system and you have a shorter blade with inconsistent steel quality, a minimal handguard, and a design optimized entirely for a formation context that no longer exists. The Viking sword was longer, made from metallurgically superior steel at every quality level from average to elite, equipped with a functional crossguard enabling blade control, and wielded by fighters trained for exactly the individual engagements where every Gladius advantage collapsed simultaneously. The Roman system would have beaten the Viking individual. The Viking sword would have destroyed the Roman blade. Those are two different questions. The physics only answers one of them. And on that question, the gap between these two weapons was not close, not marginal, and not a matter of debate. The Gladius conquered the ancient world. The Viking sword was built from a future the ancient world never reached.